Thank you so much, Ruben and Scott, for the invitation. It's so nice to see you all here and being part for the first time of this Race Before Race forum. My name is Mónica Domínguez Torres, and something you don't get from the biography that I gave for the brochure is the fact I am from Venezuela. So I was born and raised in Venezuela. The other fact that doesn't show there is that actually my master's and PhD I completed in Canada. So I have in the University of Toronto. So I have also a soft spot for Canada. So in somehow I feel that I bridge South America and North America. But I'm particularly appreciative about for the opportunity of sharing my research and my thoughts with you and exploring further the complex issue of trying to understand this very complex concept of indigeneity, especially in how it relates to the visual record. And as an art historian, it is very important for me to look at images, of course. That's what art historians primarily do. And as Scott mentioned this morning, early in the morning, one of the elements, and let me, where I move here? Oh, here, okay. One of the elements that were very evident for me very early on when I started moving towards exploring further this region where I was born, the Caribbean, was the fact that despite so many developments in the field of cartography, and as you see this early map from 1562, there is a very accurate kind of recording of the lands, of the geography of the region. But despite of that, when it dealt with the communities or the peoples that were in there in that land, the panorama was completely different. So here you have some of the first images that circulated from the Colombian encounter. Let's put it in a mild way, because of course we know that was pretty much an invasion. But here I show them to you. These images are easy to be dismissed, thinking, okay, artists didn't really have much to go after because what they had were text, and was difficult for them to translate from the text what it was that really these Europeans that arrived to the Caribbean were actually seeing. But the reality it is that these images are particularly helpful for us to see what it was in the mind of Europeans where we're thinking about encountering and actually invading new lands. And what we see here is two elements that immediately stood out for them. One was the nudity of those communities, as they put it, and it was a way of codifying their barbarian kind of a state, and this comes from way long before, and I'm so happy that Ashley talked about these kind of ideas that have the root in the Greco-Roman past. The other element, of course, it was the idea that these were cannibals or anthropophagites, that these communities ate each other. That was an idea that was spread out by Columbus himself, and it became particularly influential for the images that were recorded in this period. And what it is important then for our historians, and this was not the field I encountered when I became an art historian myself, now what thinking about critical race theory and thinking about what these images do, what it is important for us then is to unveil what are the logics behind those kind of creations. Because it is not only a matter of showing or naming those other communities that they first encounter as different, but it was actually a kind of pernicious way of classifying them as objects ripe for enslavement. And that was the main idea. If you were eating each other, you were less than humans, so you didn't have use of reason, and therefore you had, the Europeans had the right to enforce themselves into these lands, conquer and establish in there. For many, many years, our historians just swept under the rug these images, thinking, well, artists in Europe didn't know better. And this is not really the right approach, I think, and many of my colleagues working these days think the same way, because, again, these images really codify what it is going on in their minds and really help us to articulate what it is, the logics of settler colonialism. So we cannot see them for representing indigenous cultures, but they can actually help us to unveil those kind of ways on how Europeans were in many ways presenting these communities to the rest of the world and to themselves to justify what they were doing in these places. And even after some self-professed ethnographers, of course, a word that was not used at the time, but that was what they imply in their writings, when some European writers established themselves in the Caribbean and started documenting this, what they were seeing in these lands. For example, the Spaniard Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés, they were mostly interested in the objects of these, that these cultures produce and that they were actually profiting from. For example, the hammock that you see here, or the dwellings that were created by the indigenous communities in there, and they were particularly helpful for their first settlements. Actually, many of the first European settlements just follow the same architectural practices of the indigenous communities that were in there. They were recording those elements that were useful, again, for the colonialist agenda, but they were very rarely capturing the communities, the peoples that they were encountering. Descriptions are really, really brief, and the images are even worse. There is not much to go from. In the case of Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, one of the few images where he includes people is because precisely the kind of function that they had for the overall project of colonization, the labor that they were making for the European masters, for the Spaniards, in extracting gold, in panning gold in the island of Hispaniola, what it is today, Santo Domingo, Haiti. And as Alison Bigelow has shown beautifully in her book, Mining Language, Racial Thinking, Indigenous Knowledge, and Colonial Metallurgy in the Early Modern Iberian Period. I'm sorry, I'm kind of between two different screens, and this is not moving the same way that the other screen is moving. So this was the image that I was mentioning of indigenous people panning for gold in the island of Hispaniola. So as Alison Bigelow has shown us in her book, these images that at least the hand drawings that Oviedo was producing were capturing a little bit of some specificities from those communities. Those specificities started getting washed out once the book is going through the printing process. So this is the first, on the right, the first print of this book, and you see how now these are just generic human beings. There is nothing ethnographic about it, maybe just the kind of container with which they are doing the labor, but there is not much to go from those images for us to understand or to know better those communities. And those are communities that are, of course, already under colonial rule. this is not just happening with Spaniards, I have to say. This is the same kind of practice that people from other European nations were doing, and in this it reveals that they all share the same kind of common understanding of what was the project of expanding to other lands. So the Italian Girolamo Benzoni, who also settled in the Americas for a little bit, in South America in particular, and in the Caribbean, also wrote his own account of what he encountered there and the peoples that he encountered there. And, but he follows very much a script very similar to Oviedo. He pays more attention to the objects that these communities created, how they use them, in the case of the hammock, replicating what Oviedo had done before, or just mentioning curious episodes of different people that he encountered. But he doesn't really describe in much detail the people themselves, but only the kind of objects and elements that they provide for the colonizers, actually. In this particular image I pass really quickly, it's talking about an indigenous woman who is bringing fruit to the Europeans that are gathering in there, and we see that she is represented in a very strange way, trying to reflect what it was, the tattoos, the painting her body, the different ornaments that she brought, but in ways that render them almost unrecognizable in the image. So even when some authors start injecting more, let's say, ethnographic elements into their representation, which is the case with Theodore de Brie, who reprinted or republished the book by Girolamo Benzoni, has the 4-volume of his Americas series. We see that veneer of accuracy or of really observing these communities, what it shows is a completely distorted view of what it is happening in there, but at the same time allow us again to look at the logics behind this settler colonialist kind of project. So here we have some of the images in which they are referring to what is happening in the Caribbean, what Girolamo Benzoni says that it is happening in the Caribbean. But if we pay attention, for example, to the plate number 12 that I have remarked a little bit there, and that has been of particular interest for me because it shows a scene of provision, and I have been very concerned about the idea of how Europeans were representing this particular activity. The way on how the indigenous people performing this activity in the region are depicted is actually showing them in the same guise of cannibals, even though the act of shopping bodies is no longer part of the scene. This idea is woven into the narrative a much more subtle way, but one that was understandable to an European audience by equating the Native Americans from the Caribbean, or from this particular region, what it is today, the coast of the western side of Venezuela, with the Tupi cultures from Brazil, which had been already published about very often in Europe, has described their cannibalistic kind of practices. And you see in there how in a previous publication, already Theodore de Brie had put together a lot of these accounts about the Tupi peoples from Brazil, and has used the same kind of a tonsure-like kind of haircut for the Native Americans of Central America as the one from the Tupi, that this is actually something that was reported by another eyewitness, Jean de Lery, French colonist that was actually in the area, what it is today, Rio de Janeiro. So this idea of connecting the Caribbean with cannibalism then still is in there, and we see it also in other kind of images when they are talking, for example, about indigenous revolts in this particular area. So here, for example, we have one episode that it is illustrated by Theodore Debris, which doesn't appear illustrated in the original volume by Girolamo Benzoni, where the local communities are attacking Spanish friars, and they are attacking them with these clubs that were at the time very well known to be Tupi objects. They were called the Iberapeme. And they were in many collections in Europe. It was something that was also connected to these particular communities from Brazil. So, and this, of course, was a matter of choice. Theodore Debris had also published books from other kind of ethnographic accounts. We know very well, I'm very sure most of you are familiar with the image of Virginia based on the drawings by John Smith. And then there were others about Florida that were also based on a French expedition and a French painter creating them. So he could actually have chosen those images, but I think, and I articulate that point in my most recent book, Pearls for the Crown, Art, Nature and Race in the Age of Spanish Expansion, that this was intentional to convey in a kind of more veiled way the same idea that these were cannibalistic communities, and therefore Spaniards or Europeans in general, because it was not only the Spaniards who were partaking of all this industry, or any European could then enslave them and use them as labor because they were not rational human beings, as I mentioned at the beginning. So there are many elements that, and I'm not going to completely dissect all these images today, but there are many elements that if we look very closely, we deploy the tools that as art historians we have and we have learned throughout the years, they become very clear. For example, the way on how the land is represented. They are connecting these Native American communities to these particular regions, regardless of the actual presence or the actual building practices that they deploy in those places. Here is very clear, for example, how they are presenting them again as these nude people who don't have very strong traditions with garments and so on. But also another element that is very clear from the text that accompany these images is that they are portrayed as naive and gullible kind of people who didn't know the value of exchange. So they will exchange, for example, pearls that were very appreciated by Europeans for nothing, for trinkets. And that was a kind of pervasive narrative that existed in the colonial record, and that it is expressed in images like this constantly. But also the fact that their homes, for example, are presented, and I will see here their lands, in ways that have nothing to do with the actual communities that live there. Because we see that what Theodore Debris is doing there is reproducing one of John White's representation of the villages of the Algonquins. So taking one indigenous community for the other as the same way, or mixing them as he did for the Tupis, actually presenting Caribbean indigenous communities as Tupi communities. There are, however, some instances where we see that some of the realities that are happening on the ground are also kind of permeating this particular text. So in the case of, there is this particular drawing created by Theodore Debris, illustrating again Girolamo Benzoni. He is actually visualizing. Okay, 20 minutes, so I'm going to wrap up quickly. He is visualizing some of the realities that Benzoni saw, and it was these massive campaigns of enslaving communities. So here we see that they are bringing, and the text explained to us, communities from inland to be sold off as an slave labor to Europeans active in the islands of the Caribbean. And the way on how they are doing it is actually criticized by Girolamo Benzoni in his text, and Theodore Debris has presented it to us. So here we see a reality when we compare it to the record, we realize the historical record, archival record, then we realize, yeah, this was the practice that was continuously done in there. Communities were displaced, forcefully brought to other areas. Communities, for example, the Lucayans in the Bahamas were brought forcefully to the Southern Caribbean to work for the Spanish pearl bosses, extracting pearls. And there were all sorts of displacement between these different communities in the Caribbean. So we usually tend to think about the term indigeneity as connected to the land, but what happens then in the cases where these people were forcefully removed and actually displaced, and in many cases they actually settle again in other areas. So with these images of the Spanish process of colonization, I wanted to kind of question not only the way on how our history has been carried out for many years. I think for our historians coming after this generation, of which I am part, trying to unveil those other areas, it will really be important to see not only what the images show, but what they don't show, and contrast it to the reality, the situation in the ground, and deconstructing all those layers of falsifications that were made throughout the centuries to avoid falling into the trap of thinking about this visual record as something that could be helpful for future generations of understanding. If it's helpful at all, it is my point of view, it will be to precisely dismantle and to show that other side of the process of colonization. And with that, I want to wrap up to have time for questions and for comments. I have more material that I didn't get to show you, but hopefully that we can further discuss this idea of what indigeneity mean in the Caribbean context, in particular in the 16th century, when the process of settler colonization was so devastating that not only implied the biological warfare, the displacement, the enslavement of communities, and but also how that gets presented in the visual record, and how we can then combat those pernicious images that have been created and create a kind of alternative for them. Thank you. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or any kind of thoughts about all of this. Melinda, hi.
Hi. I'm Melinda Lowry. I'm from the Lumbee tribe, North Carolina. Thank you for, anyway, I have so many questions, but I think the first one is looking at this image in particular, but some of the earlier ones by Debris. I feel like I'm seeing such resonance with European art of this same general time period with senses of scale, landscape, kind of depth of the image. And it struck me, of course, when I compared the Venetian manuscript images with Debris' renderings. So I was just wondering, I don't have a specific comparison in mind in terms of something that comes out of Italy, for example, or Germany, but wondering if there was anything that came to your mind as you're comparing when Debris is rendering these images to other forms of European art that he's looking at, exposed to, et cetera.
Yeah, Debris is not original at all. It was actually using pieces that were already there and adapting them for his own purposes. So I didn't bring that image, but this image was for many years believed it was an original image by him. Well, I found actually the original image that it was based on. He transformed certain elements, and it was actually an image of fishing in the Persian Gulf. So nothing to do with the Americas, and he just adapted it to the context of the Caribbean. So he was not being original at all, and he was, again, creating these kind of collages. So the people that are represented in this scene of fishing in the Persian Gulf are not Tupi peoples, and he then inserts the Tupi peoples in there, and then he inserts other elements in there. But I think the place where this is even clearer is, I think it's, that one. That image, he is also casting images of religious paintings, and this is the typical pose of martyrdom that you will find in many paintings. I didn't bring here the reference, but there are several paintings that they have exactly the same shape. So he's copying that and then putting it in the context of this indigenous revolt. So yes, he's using all that kind of a stock of images that they are available to them, and readapting and modifying them to make them look like they are actually emerging from the text or from drawings that were created by the original author. But that's not the truth at all. They are completely concocted in his studio or in his printing house. And something else I wanted to mention is that he was very intentional also about what his audience was. So he knew that these images will be immediately impactful, and his books were going to sell very quickly. And he was using all the kind of latest pictorial mechanisms or tricks in order to allure, to bring these audiences to buy his books. And again, if we think about the way on how our historians have been treating these images, usually the early images of the Americas are discarded because they have no artistic quality, and therefore, and the artists didn't know what they were doing. That's the kind of typical story that you find in there. No, they were really, they knew what they were doing. It's just that they were doing it in different ways. Those were pamphlets, flyers that were circulating broadly, and they were conveying that kind of promise of a land ripe for conquest through those flyers. In this case, he's using all the arsenal that he has at hand as an artist in order to bring a much more educated audience that had the money to buy these very expensive kind of books. So therefore, he's using that kind of artistic language available to him. And this is always an issue because in our history, we tend to think about this development of style and perspective and so on in terms of artistic development related to humanism and so on, this kind of awakening from the Middle Ages and so on. Well, we have also to look at the other side of that story where actually images are very integral part of that kind of campaign or kind of orchestrated a project of a settler colonialism that it is happening in parallel.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And you know, when we say the project of settler colonialism, it sounds like this modern thing being projected in the past, but they had their own names for it too, in a certain way. And one of the things this really makes me think of, and I've looked at these images so many times, but you know, there's been a lot of talk in the last at least decade among historians of the Colombian invasion about the doctrine of discovery, based on these 15th century papal bulls pre-contact with the Americas. They're really about the coast of Africa, and who had right to them, the Spanish or the Portuguese.
Yeah.
But the main takeaway from the doctrine of discovery as it gets articulated, and then even more so with the discovery, so-called, of the Americas, is that the papal government said colonies and conquests are completely justified if the people are uncivilized and unchristian. And these seem to be very dedicated to the uncivilized aspect, as though they're sending out again and again this repetition, regardless, as you say, of ethnographic correctness or specificity. You know, there have been lots of articles on the so-called Tupinambization of all peoples in the Americas, because they were a handy, well-known so-called cannibal people. And then, of course, the heightened images of violence. But I feel like this is just all in the service of the doctrine of discovery, which is not something, you know, people were very aware of, for the fact that it's only been really the last decade that there's been a lot of talk about it.
Yeah.
And only that because it appears bizarrely in the Marshall trilogy in 1823 from Justice Marshall. He invokes it, and people are like, what the hell is that? And why is papal law being brought into U.S. law over native title? That aside, I just feel like now that I'm looking at these, and you're talking about the elites that he's appealing, that Debris is, I mean, he is really giving them the fodder they need to justify, well, look at these people, you know, look what they do. And it fascinates me because then there's an authenticity aspect. Every now and then you throw in a hammock or an ethnographically correct club, you know, but no, it's like this kind of salting it with some veracity.
Exactly.
But otherwise, it's part of a massive land grab and really justification
Exactly.
for all the sins that will happen there. So
Exactly.
thank you for, I mean, it's like seeing them again, like, oh yeah, I should go back and look at those. But
it is very easy to discount them because, oh, they are so fantastic.
Yeah.
It's like, no, but then if we actually pay attention to them, we realize how all these discussions that are happening at the time are really finding a visual way in these particular publications. And something I wanted to mention that we have to also keep in mind that all these images are emerging at the time when there is this discussion about the fact if Native American communities are rational human beings or not.
Exactly.
So all of this is happening at this particular time. So there are some groups in Europe advocating for, they are rational human beings, and therefore the only method can be evangelization, converting them to Christianity instead of enslavement. That was the other one, if they were no rational human beings. Not that there were any good options there anyways, but these discussions were really happening in the background of when these things are being produced. And again, it doesn't matter if the original producer of the text or the images that then were transformed by debris was Spanish or Italian or German. He was actually taken, he was free for all. He could take from anyone. And at the end, and that's an element I demonstrate in my book on Pearls for the Crown, it is that all of them at the end share the same kind of basic principles that today we call it settler colonialism. Yeah. And they criticize the other in the ways on how they are conducting their project, but at the end it's because they all want to do pretty much the same. It's not, it's competition, rivalries among themselves, not necessarily in the way on how they are going to connect or to relate to these communities on the other side of the Atlantic.
That's great. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Monica, thank you for that talk. I was really struck by the way you made explicit the portability of the stereotypes and just in this point, like the kind of larger project that this is serving. But I'm wondering, like, when you talk about combating this pernicious images, I'd love to hear more about how to do that. Like, I wonder if there's like, how do you read it against itself?
Exactly.
Right, like, and so, like, the routes that Ashley introduced, for instance, right, the refusal, the investigation, maybe, is there another route where it's trying to give a certain agenda, but it's undermining itself? Like, in other words, because it's dangerous to bring this in and then just state it and sort of affirm, even if you're saying, no, this is a European mind you're looking at. Mm-hmm. But students who are not familiar with this, there's a kind of capital to it, right? Oh, look at this, this sense of like a real end. So how do we undo that? Mm-hmm. So an example is like the fishing, right? Oh, they are uncivilized, but fishing is a technology. Like do you know what I mean? How do, if there are examples that we can continue to undo the work that it's trying to do against itself, right? Anyway, hopefully.
Yeah, I think the trick in here, as I see it and how I try to practice is teach students to look and read against the grain. So to look and read critically. So, and this is not easy. It's not something, especially in this age where we are surrounded and bombarded with so many images, it's not easy. It's normal to give for granted that the images reflect something that exists out there and to question them. So I think that that's the main issue, and that's will be my role as art historian, advocating for more art history, for the importance of art history, in teaching not so much about the facts from the past, but in that kind of skill of looking critically, because it is very easy to then take at face value. I mean, conspiracy theories are made out of accepting at face value the images that are circulated or the ideas that are put out there for who knows whom, but that's how they are created. So I think, that's the point, and I think it is really looking twice, and I think in that sense, for those of us who didn't have that training of looking critically at images and text, as an art historian, I learned how to look critically at images, not so much at text, and that was something that immediately became evident to me. I also had to learn that, because guess what? All these images were created and reinforced by the text that they are accompanying. So I had to also train myself, almost like a pseudo-literary scholar, to be able to then dismantle what those narratives are doing. And that's why I appreciate so much this encounter and talking about King Lear and Shakespeare and so on, because it is important. All these things have to be brought together in order to then really combat this kind of very long and damaging tradition that existed in academia and in the world in general.
Hi, I just wanted to build on that and say I think the other thing is we can return to the materials, right, and the objects, because Oviedo might have been only interested in them for what he could get out of them.
Exactly.
Or for how it could further colonization. But if we think about the people who made them and the skills it took to make them, and if we lead our students to think about that, even though Oviedo's representation of a hammock is wrong in so many ways, you can still talk about the skill it would take to create the cordage, to knot the netting, and you can connect it then to, indigenous women on Mona under colonization, yes, being forced to make it for export, but also still taking care of their families and their families' bodies, through making those hammocks. And the same thing, he's got another image of women making cassava bread. Right, so that there are ways to, I think, get students to think about, as you said, what is not in the picture, and what does it take to create the things.
Yeah,
clearer
that's
picture.
is so helpful. And actually, I want to bring here the work of, for example, anthropologists who are doing precisely that. For example, looking at the crucial role that canoes, that was one of the few objects that were constantly being reproduced by Europeans, because they were actually instrumental in this process of colonization. The Spaniards had to adapt the use of the canoe for their own particular purposes, because there were many regions, particularly in this area, where they couldn't go with their galleons, with their caravels. Many of them went aground because precisely these territories these areas are not for those big vessels. So they had to actually learn that technology and appropriate it in many ways for their own project of colonization. So, and this is really important, that when we think about these indigenous traditions, to think about how they persisted in time, that they show that element of resistance, but also how they were instrumental as well for Europeans in order to carry out their project. That's something I try to do with the book on pearls, because without the local knowledge on how to extract the oysters, to locate the oysters, to extract the pearls, there was never going to be a pearl industry. So indigenous knowledge was always at the core of what is happening. And if we dig into these images, then we can find those elements in those images as well, that allows us then to explore further what was happening with those traditions and how they persisted or not. Like one of those is clearly the construction of bohíos and canais, that are those kind of indigenous structure. That's a tradition that hasn't died out. It's still there. It has been used in many regions in the Caribbean. We now maybe associate them with, the palapas of the touristic places and so on. But no, they have actually persisted, and indigenous communities still create them. So there are ways of using them for introducing indigenous concepts as well, always with the caveat that they have been, in many cases, so falsified that, and what are some of the underlying concepts and ideas that are in there that are actually going against also of this act of recovering the indigenous past.
Thanks so much, Monica. Join me in thanking Monica.